Today, I'm going to tell you the story of Jack Morrison, a Vietnam veteran who decided to honor a forgotten Native American soldier. Jack discovered that Tommy Crow Feather, a decorated Afghanistan veteran, had died alone with no one to claim his body for burial. But the outcome exceeded all expectations. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. The honor no one expected. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, turning the red earth into thick mud that clung to everything it touched. Jack Morrison pulled his worn leather jacket tighter as he stood outside the county morgue, water dripping from the brim of his old military cap. At 62, the Vietnam veteran had seen enough death to last several lifetimes, but something about this particular case had been eating at him for weeks. "You sure about this, Jack?" Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cold October air. "The county's been trying to find family for 2 months. Nobody's coming forward." Jack's weathered hands trembled slightly as he lit another cigarette. His third in the past hour, the ember glowed orange against the grey morning sky. "That's exactly why someone needs to do this," he replied, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who'd smoked too many cigarettes and said too few prayers. "Tommy Crow Feather served his country just like I did. Difference is, I came back to parades and handshakes. He came back to nothing." Inside the morgue, Tommy's body lay covered by a simple white sheet. The 28-year-old Lakota veteran had been found in his studio apartment 3 weeks ago, alone and forgotten. 2 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. None of it mattered when he'd returned home to Pine Ridge with invisible wounds that ran deeper than any battlefield injury. Dr. Patricia Williams, the county coroner, emerged from her office with a clipboard clutched against her chest. Her usually neat appearance showed signs of the long hours she'd been working. "I've contacted every veterans organization in the state, Jack. The tribal council says they'll handle it eventually, but..." She let the sentence hang in the air like the cigarette smoke that seemed to follow Jack everywhere. "Eventually isn't good enough," Jack said firmly, crushing his cigarette under the heel of his scuffed work boot. "I've got money saved up. Not much, but enough for a proper funeral. Military honors, the whole thing." Maria Santos had known Jack for 15 years, ever since she'd started working for the sheriff's department. She'd seen him help dozens of veterans navigate the maze of VA paperwork and benefit claims. But this was different. This felt personal in a way she couldn't quite understand. The funeral home director, Robert Chen, had been reluctant at first. "Mr. Morrison, without family authorization, there are certain procedures we need to follow. Legal complications could arise." But something in Jack's eyes, a mixture of determination and barely contained grief, had changed his mind. By the time arrangements were finalized, word had begun to spread through Pine Ridge's small veteran community. Phone calls were made to American Legion posts across South Dakota. Emails went out to VFW chapters. Social media posts appeared on veteran forums. The message was simple. Tommy Crow Feather would not be buried alone. The day of the funeral arrived grey and cold, with that particular stillness that seems to settle over small towns during important moments. Jack stood in his bedroom, carefully ironing his dress uniform, the same one he'd worn to too many funerals over the years. The blue fabric showed its age, but the medals and ribbons were polished to perfection. At Peaceful Rest Cemetery, groundskeepers had prepared a modest gravesite under a large oak tree. The funeral home had provided a simple but dignified casket, draped with an American flag that snapped and rippled in the prairie wind. Jack arrived early, wanting to ensure everything was perfect for Tommy's send-off. Father Michael O'Brien from St. Agnes Catholic Church had volunteered to perform the service, even though he'd never met Tommy. "Every person deserves to be remembered with dignity," he'd told Jack over coffee the night before. The priest stood now beside the grave, his black vestments a stark contrast against the golden autumn grass. As the appointed time approached, Jack found himself alone except for the funeral director, the priest, and 3 cemetery workers. His heart sank as he checked his watch. Maybe his efforts had been in vain. Maybe nobody really cared about one more forgotten veteran. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of highway traffic and the rustling of dead leaves in the oak tree above. Jack thought about Tommy's service record, which he'd studied countless times over the past weeks. The young man had enlisted right out of high school, driven by the same sense of duty that had once compelled Jack to serve. Tommy had been a communications specialist, responsible for maintaining radio contact between forward operating bases in some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. His unit had lost 4 men during his first deployment, 6 during his second. The records showed Tommy had been recommended for promotion twice, but something had changed after his second tour. The commendations became incident reports, missed formations, unpaid debts, conflicts with superior officers, the classic signs of a soldier struggling with demons that only other veterans could truly understand. When Tommy finally returned to Pine Ridge, he tried to find work, tried to reconnect with his community, but the reservation had its own struggles: unemployment, poverty, and a suicide rate among young men that made national headlines. Tommy had bounced between odd jobs and VA appointments, between hope and despair, until the day his landlord found him collapsed in his kitchen. Jack pulled out his phone and scrolled through the messages he'd received that morning. A few responses from veteran groups, mostly expressing sympathy but explaining they couldn't attend on such short notice. One message from his own son in Denver, promising to drive down for the service but warning he might be late due to work obligations. The wind picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across the cemetery grounds like tiny lost souls. Jack zipped his jacket higher and wondered if he'd made a mistake. Maybe a quiet burial would have been more appropriate. Maybe drawing attention to Tommy's lonely death would only emphasize the failure of everyone, including Jack himself, to reach him while he was still alive. When brothers answer the call. Jack was about to signal Father O'Brien to begin the service when he heard it, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines cutting through the prairie silence. He turned toward the cemetery entrance, squinting against the grey morning light as a single headlight appeared on the access road. Then another, and another. The first motorcycle was a weathered Harley-Davidson, its chrome dulled by years of highway miles. The rider wore a black leather vest, adorned with military patches and POW MIA emblems. Behind him followed a procession that seemed to materialize from the South Dakota landscape itself, dozens of motorcycles, pickup trucks, and cars stretching back along the rural highway. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Father O'Brien whispered, clutching his prayer book tighter as the convoy approached. The funeral director, Robert Chen, frantically began making phone calls, presumably to arrange for additional chairs that wouldn't be needed. The lead motorcycle pulled up near the gravesite, and its rider removed his helmet to reveal a grizzled face marked by sun and time. He was perhaps Jack's age, with silver hair tied back in a ponytail and eyes that held the unmistakable 1,000-yard stare of a combat veteran. "You, Jack Morrison?" the man asked, extending a calloused hand. "Name's Eddie Blackhorse. Got your message through the veteran networks. Drove down from Rapid City with some friends." As Eddie spoke, more vehicles continued arriving. Men and women in military dress uniforms emerged from cars. Motorcycle riders in leather vests lined up their bikes with military precision. Families with children gathered near the back, some carrying small American flags. Jack's throat tightened as he watched the scene unfold. A group of Native American veterans approached the casket, one carrying a traditional eagle feather. Another veteran, missing his left arm, struggled momentarily with his dress uniform before a fellow veteran stepped forward to help adjust his ribbons. "How did you all know?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Word travels fast in the Brotherhood," replied a woman in Air Force dress blues. She was young, perhaps 30, with short-cropped black hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Master Sergeant Lisa Running Bear, 366th Fighter Wing. Tommy and I served together at Bagram Air Base." Jack stared at her in amazement. "You knew Tommy?" "He saved my life," she said simply. "Twice." When the forward operating base came under mortar attack, Tommy stayed at his radio for 6 hours straight, coordinating air support while the rest of us were in bunkers. Never left his post, even when shrapnel cut his face open. More veterans continued arriving, each with their own story, their own connection to either Tommy or the broader military community. An elderly Korean War veteran leaned heavily on a walker, supported by his grandson. A group of Vietnam veterans stood together, their grey hair and lined faces testament to decades of carrying invisible burdens. The crowd had swelled to over 200 people, far more than the small cemetery had ever accommodated. Groundskeepers scrambled to rope off additional areas to prevent damage to nearby graves. Local police arrived to direct traffic on the increasingly congested access road. Father O'Brien approached Jack, his earlier nervousness replaced by something approaching awe. "I've been conducting military funerals for 20 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen anything like this." Among the assembled crowd, Jack noticed a group of younger veterans standing slightly apart from the others. They were perhaps Tommy's age, their faces bearing the particular exhaustion that comes from recent combat deployments. One of them, a Hispanic man with sergeant's stripes on his dress uniform, stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Sergeant Carlos Ruiz, 101st Airborne. Tommy and I went through basic training together." His voice carried a slight tremor as he continued. "When we heard what you were doing, we knew we had to be here. Tommy wrote to me a few times after he got back. He was struggling, but he was trying. He deserved better than what he got." The wind had died down, and the cemetery fell into an almost reverent silence as Father O'Brien moved to begin the service. The American flag, draped over Tommy's casket, hung perfectly still, its red, white, and blue colors vivid against the gray October sky. But before the priest could speak, Eddie Blackhorse raised his hand. "Father, if you don't mind, some of us would like to say a few words first, about our brother." Jack felt tears burning his eyes as he realized what was happening. These weren't just random veterans who had shown up out of duty or obligation. These were Tommy's brothers and sisters in arms, people whose lives had been touched by a young man that most of the world had forgotten. A Native American veteran stepped forward, holding the eagle feather with both hands. "In our tradition," he began, his voice carrying across the silent cemetery, "no warrior goes to his final rest alone. Tommy Crow Feather was a warrior. He fought for his country, he fought for his brothers, and he fought battles that most of us will never understand." The assembled crowd seemed to lean forward, hanging on every word. Jack looked around at the faces surrounding Tommy's grave, young and old, male and female, representing every branch of the military and every background imaginable. Yet they all shared something fundamental, something that had brought them here on a cold October morning to honor a man most of them had never met. Stories that bind warriors together. The Native American veteran holding the eagle feather stepped closer to Tommy's casket, his weathered boots crunching softly on the frost-covered grass. "My name is Joseph Ironcloud," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years and experience. "I served 2 tours in Iraq with the 1st Infantry Division. I never met Tommy Crowfeather in person, but I know his story because it's the story of too many of our young warriors." Joseph raised the eagle feather toward the gray sky, then gently placed it on the American flag, covering Tommy's casket. "This feather represents the spirit of a warrior who has completed his earthly journey. In our tradition, the eagle carries our prayers to the Creator. Tommy's spirit will not walk alone." Jack wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, overwhelmed by the dignity and reverence of the moment. Around him, veterans stood at attention, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief, respect, and recognition. Many had their own stories of struggle, their own battles with invisible wounds that society preferred not to acknowledge. Master Sergeant Lisa Running Bear stepped forward next. "Tommy saved my life during a mortar attack at Forward Operating Base Shank," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because 3 months after I returned stateside, Tommy called me at 2 in the morning. He was having a panic attack, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop the memories from coming." She paused, looking down at the casket. We talked for 4 hours that night, about the sounds, the smells, the weight of carrying a radio that connected you to life and death decisions every single day. Tommy told me that sometimes he felt like he was still there, still crouched in that communications bunker, waiting for the next attack. The crowd listened in absolute silence. Several veterans nodded knowingly, recognizing their own experiences in Lisa's words. "I should have done more," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "We all should have done more. That's why we're here today. Not just to honor Tommy, but to promise that we won't let another brother or sister face their demons alone." Sergeant Carlos Ruiz moved to stand beside Lisa. "Tommy and I used to talk about what we'd do when we got home," he said. He wanted to work with kids on the reservation, maybe become a teacher. He said the children needed to see that someone from their community could serve their country and come home with honor. Carlos reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded letter. "Tommy wrote this to me 6 months ago. He gave me permission to share it if anything ever happened to him." He unfolded the paper with shaking hands. He wrote, "Carlos, if you're reading this, it means I lost my last battle, but I want people to know that I didn't give up because I was weak. I gave up because the weight of carrying everyone's pain became too heavy, even for a warrior." A sob escaped from somewhere in the crowd. Jack looked around and saw tears on faces both young and old, male and female. The pain was universal, transcending age, race, and background. Eddie Blackhorse, the veteran who had arrived first on his motorcycle, stepped forward. "Tommy's letter continues," Carlos said, handing the paper to Eddie. "I rode with the Patriot Guard riders for 15 years, Eddie said, his gravelly voice carrying across the cemetery. "We've attended hundreds of military funerals, mostly for young men and women killed in action overseas. This is different. This is about a warrior who made it home but couldn't find his way back to living." Eddie looked directly at Jack. "Mr. Morrison, what you did, taking responsibility for a fellow veteran you'd never met, that's what brotherhood looks like. Tommy's letter says, 'I hope someday there will be more people like the old-timers who understand that coming home isn't the same as healing.'" Father O'Brien stepped forward, his prayer book clutched against his chest. "If I may," he said softly, "I'd like to share something that Tommy's former landlord told me yesterday. She said that every month Tommy would put $20 under the door of an elderly woman in his apartment building. When the landlord asked him about it, Tommy said the woman reminded him of his grandmother, and his grandmother always told him that warriors take care of those who cannot take care of themselves." The priest's words seemed to settle over the crowd like a benediction. Jack felt a profound sense of connection to this young man he'd never met, this warrior whose final act of service had been to bring together a community of people who understood loss, sacrifice, and the true meaning of brotherhood. A young woman in army dress uniform raised her hand. "My name is Private First Class Sarah Whitehorse," she said. "I'm about to deploy to Afghanistan next month. Listening to all of you today, hearing Tommy's story, it reminds me that we're not just fighting for our country overseas. We're fighting to come home to communities that understand and support us." She looked around at the assembled veterans. "I want to make a promise here at Tommy's grave. When I come home, I won't forget about the warriors who are still fighting their battles on American soil. Tommy's death won't be meaningless if we learn from it." The crowd murmured agreement, a low rumble of voices expressing solidarity and commitment. Jack realized that something extraordinary was happening at this small cemetery in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Tommy Crow Feather's funeral had become more than a memorial service. It had become a rallying cry for change, the legacy of one last mission. As Father O'Brien began the formal religious service, Jack noticed something remarkable happening around Tommy's grave. Veterans who had arrived as strangers were exchanging phone numbers, sharing stories, and making connections that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. The funeral had become an impromptu reunion of souls who understood each other in ways that civilian society never could. The priest's words carried across the cemetery with unexpected power. "We gather today not just to mourn Tommy Crow Feather, but to celebrate a life that touched others in ways he never knew. His service to his country, his quiet acts of kindness, and yes, even his final struggle have brought together a community that will honor his memory through action. When the religious portion of the service concluded, a military honor guard that had assembled spontaneously from among the attending veterans stepped forward. They had no official sanction, no formal orders, but their movements were precise and dignified as they prepared to perform the traditional flag-folding ceremony. Eddie Blackhorse and 7 other veterans carefully lifted the American flag from Tommy's casket, stretching it taut above the polished wood. The flag snapped once in the prairie wind before they began the ceremonial folding, each crease executed with military precision that spoke to years of training and countless similar ceremonies. As the flag was folded into its final triangular shape, Jack stepped forward. He had assumed he would receive the flag as the person who had arranged the service, but Eddie handed it instead to an elderly Native American woman who had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. "Mrs. Crow Feather," Eddie said gently. "We found Tommy's great-aunt. She's been looking for him since he returned from Afghanistan." The woman, perhaps 70 years old, with silver hair braided down her back, accepted the flag with trembling hands. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she held the symbol of her great-nephew's service against her chest. "Tommy used to visit me when he first came home," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "But then he stopped coming. I tried to find him, but—" She looked up at the crowd of veterans surrounding her. "I never imagined he had so many brothers and sisters who cared about him." Jack felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Master Sergeant Lisa Running Bear. "Mr. Morrison, what you started here today is bigger than just Tommy's funeral. You've shown us what we need to do for each other." She gestured toward the crowd of veterans. "Look around. Do you see what's happening? People are sharing contact information, talking about support groups, making plans to check on each other. Tommy's death is bringing life to something that should have existed all along." Carlos Ruiz approached with a notebook in his hand. "We're putting together a network," he explained to Jack. "Veterans helping veterans, monthly meetings, crisis intervention, job placement assistance. We're calling it the Tommy Crow Feather Brotherhood." Jack stared at the notebook, which already contained dozens of names and phone numbers. "You're naming it after Tommy?" "His story represents everything we're trying to prevent," Carlos replied. "No veteran should face their demons alone. No warrior should be forgotten. Tommy's last mission is to make sure that never happens again to anyone else." As the formal ceremony concluded, people began to disperse slowly, reluctant to break the powerful bonds that had been forged over the past hour. Some veterans lingered near the grave, leaving personal mementos alongside the eagle feather. Others gathered in small groups, continuing conversations that had started during the service. Mrs. Crow Feather approached Jack, still clutching the folded flag. "Thank you," she said simply. "You gave my great-nephew the honor he deserved. You brought his family home to him." Jack looked around at the veterans scattered across the cemetery grounds. "I think Tommy brought his family home to all of us," he replied. 6 months later, Jack stood in the community center of Pine Ridge, watching as nearly 100 veterans gathered for the monthly meeting of the Tommy Crow Feather Brotherhood. The organization had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, with chapters forming in 12 states across the American West. Eddie Blackhorse had been elected president of the organization, and Master Sergeant Lisa Running Bear served as coordinator for crisis intervention services. They had helped 17 veterans find employment, prevented 4 suicides through immediate intervention, and connected dozens of struggling warriors with the mental health services they needed. On the wall behind the speaker's podium hung a large photograph of Tommy Crow Feather in his military dress uniform, taken during his basic training graduation. Below it was a plaque with the organization's motto, "No warrior stands alone." As Jack listened to veterans sharing their stories and offering support to one another, he thought about the young man who had died alone in a studio apartment, forgotten by a society that had moved on from the wars he had fought. Tommy's death had seemed meaningless at the time, a tragic waste of a life that had already given so much. But looking around the room at the faces of veterans who were no longer fighting their battles in isolation, Jack realized that Tommy Crow Feather had completed one final mission. He had united a brotherhood that would ensure his sacrifice was not in vain and that no warrior would ever again be buried unclaimed and alone. The funeral that Jack had organized for a stranger had become the foundation for something much larger than either of them could have imagined. Tommy's legacy lived on in every veteran who found hope, in every warrior who discovered they were not forgotten, and in every life that was saved by the brotherhood that bore his name. In death, Tommy Crow Feather had finally found his way home to a family that would never let him go.